They said Earl Hendricks had finally lost his mind. A heated feeding station in the middle of Dakota winter, serving warm fermented mash to newborn calves like some kind of bovine breakfast service. The other ranchers called it the most ridiculous waste of time and money they had ever witnessed. Earl built it anyway, ignoring the laughter, the head shaking, the warnings that he was throwing away decades of proven tradition. When temperatures plunged to 50 below and calves started dying by the dozen across 3 counties, Earl's 6 newborns kept eating, kept growing, kept thriving. And the men who had mocked him loudest became the first ones standing at his door, desperate to learn what he knew. Chapter 1. The Method Nobody Believed. Earl Hendricks spent the autumn of that year constructing something that made every rancher within 40 miles question his judgment. The structure itself looked simple enough from the outside, a low, insulated shed with thick walls and a sloped roof designed to shed snow. But what sat inside defied everything these men understood about feeding cattle in winter. The heart of the system was a series of insulated troughs connected to an underground heating network. Earl had dug trenches the previous summer, laying pipes that ran beneath massive compost piles positioned strategically around the feeding station. The decomposing organic matter generated steady heat, warming water that circulated through the system and kept the feeding troughs at a constant temperature just above body heat. Into these troughs, Earl planned to pour a fermented grain mash he had been perfecting for months, a mixture of barley, oats, and molasses that underwent controlled fermentation to break down complex starches into easily digestible sugars. The science made sense to Earl, even if it made him look like a fool to everyone else. Newborn calves in extreme cold faced a brutal metabolic equation. Their small bodies burned enormous calories, simply maintaining core temperature, calories that had to come from food. But conventional winter feeding offered cold hay and frozen silage, feed that required significant energy just to warm up inside the digestive system before any nutrients could be extracted. A calf eating frozen feed in sub-zero temperatures was essentially running a deficit, spending more energy processing the food than the food provided. Earl's solution attacked the problem from multiple angles. Warm feed meant no metabolic cost to raise it to body temperature. Fermented grains meant pre-digested nutrients that absorbed quickly and efficiently. Frequent feeding meant constant fuel for small furnaces that could not afford to run low. The calculations he had scratched onto the back of feed invoices suggested his calves would receive nearly double the effective nutrition of conventionally fed animals, even consuming the same raw calories. Holt Mercer was the first to stop and stare. He pulled his truck alongside Earl's property on a gray October afternoon and sat with the engine idling, watching Earl test the temperature gauges on his feeding troughs. Holt had ranched this land for 30 years, his father for 40 years before that. The Mercer name carried weight in these valleys, and Holt's opinions shaped what other men thought. He rolled down his window and called across the frozen mud. The question in his voice carried an edge of genuine bewilderment mixed with something that sounded almost like offense, as if Earl's innovation was a personal insult to generations of ranching wisdom. Earl tried to explain the thermodynamics, the fermentation process, the metabolic advantages of warm feeding in extreme cold. Holt listened for perhaps 30 seconds before cutting him off with a dismissive wave. The word spread quickly after that. By the end of the week, every rancher in the county had heard about Earl Hendricks and his heated cattle restaurant. The mockery came from all directions, some of it good-natured, much of it carrying the particular cruelty that communities reserve for those who dare to do things differently. Men who had known Earl for decades suddenly looked at him with a wary distance reserved for someone whose judgment could no longer be trusted. Earl's wife Della watched all of this from the kitchen window, her expression unreadable. She had seen the calculations, had listened to Earl explain the science during long evenings at the kitchen table. She did not know if he was right, but she knew he had thought it through with the careful precision that characterized everything he did, and that was enough for her to stand beside him while the laughter echoed across property lines. The first calves came early that year, 6 of them born in the span of a single week during late November. Earl moved them to the feeding station immediately, beginning the regimen he had designed. 3 times daily, he prepared fresh batches of warm mash, carrying it to the insulated troughs where the calves learned quickly that this strange food meant warmth and satisfaction. They grew faster than any calves Earl had raised before, their coats thick and glossy, their eyes bright with the health that comes from bodies not constantly fighting for survival. The weather reports grew increasingly ominous as December approached. Meteorologists spoke of an approaching system with the careful gravity of people delivering serious news. Record cold, they predicted. Historic conditions. The kind of winter that separated those who were prepared from those who only thought they were. Earl checked his compost heating system, verified his fermentation processes, and stockpiled enough grain to last through whatever was coming. Across the county, other ranchers made their own preparations, hauling extra hay to barns, checking heating systems that had served adequately for years, trusting methods that had worked for their fathers and grandfathers. None of them understood, yet that adequate would not be enough. Not for what was coming. Chapter 2. When the cold came to kill. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 18 hours. Earl stood at his window before dawn, watching the thermometer fall past readings he had never seen in his lifetime. The glass registered 52 below zero, a number that seemed almost fictional, almost impossible. The wind added its own brutality, creating conditions where exposed flesh would freeze solid in under 2 minutes. The cold at this magnitude behaved differently than ordinary winter. It did not simply chill. It attacked. Metal became brittle and shattered under normal stress. Diesel fuel turned to gel in equipment tanks. The air itself seemed to crystallize, each breath burning the lungs with ice that formed from moisture before it could be exhaled. Earl made his first feeding run at 5 in the morning, bundled in so many layers he could barely move. The walk to the feeding station took 3 times longer than usual, each step a negotiation with snow that had frozen into something closer to concrete. But when he opened the insulated door and stepped inside, warmth enveloped him like an embrace. The compost heating system was performing exactly as designed, maintaining the interior temperature above freezing despite the apocalyptic cold outside. His 6 calves stood at the troughs, already anticipating the morning feeding. Their breath came easy, their movements relaxed, their bodies showing none of the hunched tension that animals displayed when fighting cold. Earl prepared the warm mash and watched them eat with aggressive appetite, their systems fueled and ready to face whatever the day demanded. Across the county, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The phone call started coming through the emergency frequency around 7. Ranchers reporting conditions that broke their voices with desperation. Conventional feeding had become nearly impossible. Hay froze into solid blocks that cattle could not break apart. Silage turned to ice. Water systems failed despite heating elements designed for normal Dakota winters. But the real killer was not the frozen feed itself. It was what happened when calves managed to eat it. Small bodies already burning maximum calories for warmth now had to spend additional energy raising frozen food to digestible temperature. The math became lethal. Calves consumed feed that provided fewer effective calories than the energy required to process it. They were eating themselves to death, their metabolisms collapsing under demands that could not be met. Holt Mercer lost his first 2 calves before noon. He found them in his barn, still standing near the hay bales they had been trying to eat, their small bodies frozen in postures of desperate hunger. The heating system in his barn had failed to keep pace with cold that overwhelmed every calculation it was built to handle. The surviving calves stood trembling, their core temperatures dropping despite every intervention Holt attempted. The reports multiplied through the afternoon. Sam Ryder lost 5 calves in a single hour. Tom Braddock's entire early crop of 8 was dead before sunset. Marcus Webb found 3 calves frozen to the metal grating of his feeding area, their tongues stuck to surfaces so cold they had become deadly. The emergency frequency carried voice after voice, each one heavy with loss and the particular helplessness of watching animals die while being powerless to save them. Earl made his second feeding run at noon, then again at 5, maintaining the schedule his system required. Each time, he found his calves warm and thriving, their bodies properly fueled, their metabolisms running efficiently on feed that arrived ready for immediate digestion. The contrast between his feeding station and the barns scattered across the county was stark enough to feel almost unreal. By evening, the county had lost over 60 calves. Ranchers who had prepared thoroughly according to traditional methods watched in horror as their preparations proved worthless against cold that rewrote every rule they knew. The men who had laughed at Earl's heated feeding station now sat in cold trucks and colder barns, counting dead animals and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The storm showed no signs of breaking. Weather reports predicted another 36 hours of extreme conditions, temperatures that would not rise above 40 below, wind chills that made even brief outdoor exposure dangerous. For calves already weakened by inadequate nutrition and cold stress, the extended duration meant a death sentence. Earl knew what was happening beyond his property. He heard the same emergency reports, understood the same brutal mathematics of cold and survival. His system was working. His calves were alive. But the knowledge brought no satisfaction, only the heavy awareness that being right meant nothing when measured against 60 dead animals and the broken voices of men who had done everything they knew how to do. Chapter 3. The Ones Who Lived. The knock came at Earl's door before dawn on the second day. He opened it to find Holt Mercer standing on his porch, his face showing the damage that extreme cold and grief inflict on human features. Holt's eyes were red, his cheeks raw, his posture carrying the particular defeat of a man who had spent the night watching his livelihood die. Holt did not offer greetings or explanations. He simply asked if he could see the calves, his voice carrying none of the mockery that had characterized every previous conversation about Earl's feeding system. Earl led him through the snow to the insulated station, opened the door, and watched Holt's face as warmth and the smell of healthy animals washed over them both. The 6 calves stood in their enclosure, coats gleaming, bodies relaxed, eyes bright with the contentment of creatures that had never experienced real distress. They turned to look at the visitors with mild curiosity before returning their attention to the feeding troughs where remnants of the morning mash still waited. One of them, a small heifer Earl had privately named Star for the white marking on her forehead, walked over to investigate Holt's outstretched hand with the confidence of an animal that had never learned to fear. Holt stood silent for a long time. Earl could see him processing what his eyes reported, trying to reconcile these thriving calves with the dead and dying animals scattered across his own property. The warm air, the calm atmosphere, the obvious health of animals that should have been struggling for survival, according to everything Holt understood about ranching in extreme cold. Finally, Holt spoke. He acknowledged that he had been wrong. Wrong about the method. Wrong about Earl. Wrong about what it meant to prepare for winter in country that could kill without warning. His voice cracked on the admission, the words costing him something that went beyond pride into the territory of identity, of everything he thought he knew about himself and his competence as a rancher. Earl did not gloat. He explained the system instead, walking Holt through the compost heating, the fermentation process, the metabolic advantages of warm feeding. He showed him the temperature gauges, the feeding schedule, the calculations that predicted exactly the results they were witnessing. Holt listened with the intensity of a man memorizing information that might save what remained of his herd. Other ranchers began arriving within the hour. Word had spread through the emergency frequency that Earl Hendricks' calves were not just alive, but thriving, and desperate men needed to see proof before they could believe it. They came in trucks that barely ran in the cold, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, their faces showing the same mixture of grief and desperate hope that Holt had carried to Earl's door. Earl showed them all the same things: the heated feeding station, the warm mash, the calves that treated the historic blizzard like any other winter day. He answered questions until his voice grew hoarse, explaining principles that seemed obvious now, but had been invisible to men who trusted tradition over innovation. Some of the ranchers wept openly, standing in the warm shelter while their dead animals lay frozen on properties nearby. The contrast was too stark, the lesson too expensive. They had dismissed Earl as foolish, and their certainty had cost them dearly. Now they stood in his feeding station, learning from the man they had mocked, desperate to salvage something from a winter that had already taken so much. By afternoon, Earl's property had become an informal command center. Ranchers with surviving calves brought them over, crowding the feeding station beyond its intended capacity. Earl mixed batch after batch of warm mash, teaching others the fermentation process, sharing the recipe he had developed through months of careful experimentation. Della moved among the men with coffee and sandwiches, offering comfort that went beyond physical sustenance. The second night passed with 18 calves packed into a station designed for 6. The conditions were cramped, the logistics complicated, but every one of those animals survived. Their combined body heat, supplemented by the compost heating system and fueled by warm fermented mash, created a microclimate that defied the killing cold outside. Morning revealed the scope of what Earl's method had accomplished. His original 6 calves remained perfect. The 12 additional calves brought by desperate ranchers had stabilized and strengthened. 0 losses among animals fed according to his system. The number stood in brutal contrast to the county total, which had climbed past 90 dead calves by the time the weather finally began to moderate. Chapter 4. What the Winter Taught. The community meeting happened 3 weeks after the storm broke. The county agricultural hall filled beyond capacity, ranchers standing along walls and spilling into the hallway, everyone wanting to hear about the method that had become legend across 4 counties. Earl stood at the front of the room with Holt Mercer beside him, the 2 men presenting together in a display of unity that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. Earl walked the assembled ranchers through every detail: the compost heating system, the fermentation process, the feeding schedule, the metabolic mathematics that explained why warm feed provided effectively double the nutrition of cold alternatives. He had brought diagrams, cost analyses, photographs from the storm, and evidence that could not be argued with. The room remained silent except for the scratch of pens on paper as men recorded information that might save their herds next winter. Holt spoke after Earl finished. He told the assembled ranchers about his own losses, about the 8 calves that had died because he trusted methods that had worked adequately for generations. He described standing in Earl's feeding station, seeing thriving animals while his own lay dead, understanding in that moment that being right about the past meant nothing when the future demanded something different. His voice carried the weight of confession, of a proud man admitting publicly that his pride had cost him dearly. The questions continued for hours. Ranchers wanted to know about scaling the system, about costs, about modifications for different herd sizes. Earl answered what he could and admitted what he did not know, encouraging experimentation, welcoming improvements on his basic design. The knowledge belonged to anyone willing to use it. Spring revealed the full measure of what the winter had taught. Earl's 6 original calves grew into strong juveniles, their early months of optimal nutrition translating into size and health that exceeded anything he had raised before. The calves saved in his feeding station during the storm thrived on their home properties, living proof of a method that worked when traditional approaches failed. The county lost over 100 calves during that historic storm. The number represented devastation for families who had ranched the same land for generations, financial losses that would take years to recover. But it also represented a lesson that could not be ignored, a demonstration that innovation sometimes matters more than tradition, that being willing to look foolish in pursuit of better methods can mean the difference between survival and loss. Earl became known throughout the region as the rancher who fed his cattle like they were guests at a restaurant and saved every one of them doing it. The description came with respect, now instead of mockery, admiration instead of dismissal. Other ranchers built their own versions of his heated feeding stations, improving on his designs, sharing their modifications, creating a community of innovation that replaced the stubborn adherence to tradition that had cost so many animals their lives. Holt Mercer became Earl's most vocal advocate, telling anyone who would listen about the man he had mocked and the lesson that mockery had taught him. The 2 met weekly throughout the following year, planning improvements, discussing new approaches, building a friendship founded on the particular respect that comes from being proven wrong and accepting it with grace. On Earl's kitchen wall, Della hung a photograph taken during the storm, showing the feeding station standing against walls of white while 6 calves thrived inside. Below it, she wrote words that captured everything the winter had revealed. Sometimes the ridiculous is just the obvious that nobody tried yet. Earl saw it every morning and remembered the weight of certainty when everyone said he was wrong. The warm mash steaming in insulated troughs. The bright eyes of calves that never learned what cold could cost. He had been willing to look foolish, and that willingness had saved lives. The next winter would bring its own challenges, but it would also bring more feeding stations, more ranchers willing to innovate, more calves that would survive because one man refused to accept that traditional methods were the only methods. That transformation, spreading outward from a single insulated shed on Earl Hendricks' property, was worth more than any vindication. That was enough. That was more than enough.